Welcome to Comsverse, everyone. This session is called Turn Your Business Productivity Up to 11 by Extending Microsoft Teams. And the presenter today is Bill Ayres. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Lee. And good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about extending Teams, and particularly with the Sharepoint Framework, which is one of the options. So I was originally going to make it a little bit broader, but some of those topics have been covered, so I will just focus on a particular area. But I'll also talk generally as well. So it's only about half an hour of content, so it's not going to go into a huge amount of depth. But select my I'll do anything at the moment. Come back. Sponsors. Thank you all to all these excellent sponsors who, from what I can see, have stood four square behind Mark, Randy and Martin, who've done an absolutely fantastic job of organising the conference in the light of things changing. I was rather looking forward to going down to Weybridge, and it would have been great. So fingers crossed that will all happen next year. But for the time being, they've pulled together this fantastic conference, which is great. They've done a superb job, and using Teams, of course, which, why wouldn't you? So really, the story here is behind the intelligent intranet, and where Teams and some other products fit into there. And really, it's all about bringing people together and all their knowledge, and just improving business productivity by helping people find things and share knowledge. And really, the lifeblood of an organization is that shared knowledge. And if we can capture that and make it accessible and usable, we can really improve the way that businesses work and improve business efficiency, and probably no more important now than ever. But for these to work, they've got to be simple. They've got to see if I can get this to work. Simple, accessible. So, we need to. Everybody in the organization needs to use these technologies. They've got to be secure. Nothing, we're not. That's why we're using Teams and not Zoom, for example. Oh, shouldn't say that, but security is an issue in business. We've got to, think of that. Everything's got to be integrated. It's got to be intelligent. So increasingly, machine learning is becoming part of these solutions. And when we've got a lot of data to deal with, then that's really. A lot of data and machine learning really go hand in hand. But then all these business solutions need to be extensible. So no product that I've ever seen for business has ever been able to solve every situation. That every business is unique, and there are always little edge cases and things that you need to be able to deal with, so that the out of the box product is very, very rarely sufficient for what you need. So you've got to be able to extend these products. So at the center of all of these intranet solutions from Microsoft is SharePoint. Of course, I've been doing SharePoint for a long time. I suspect a few people here have been doing that as well. But wait, it's got files, news, lists, pages. There's all the information inside the organization is there inside SharePoint. But of course, this is a Teams conference, not a SharePoint conference. So we've got to say that Teams is the center of everything. But if you look behind Teams, then SharePoint is there. We don't talk about SharePoint quite as much as we used to. Teams is really where people are focusing and spending a lot of time. But SharePoint, and to some extent Exchange as well, that's what lies behind this and makes it all work, and it lies behind all that content that we see in Teams. Now, in a talk like this, or in a conference like this, you get a lot of people talking about power this and power that, power apps and power automate. And you can do a lot with these tools, and we have to look at ways of sort of no-code solutions when we're thinking about how to solve business problems. But often it comes down to what I'm just tongue-in-cheek calling proper development, where we actually have to build something at a lower level. And that used to mean many years ago, we used to do everything from the command line. Before we had Visual Studio and these these modern development tools, with graphical user interfaces, we'd do everything at the command line, and that's kind of come back, curiously enough, in a weird way, that we've come back to developing in that way. So if we look, how we've got to this point, the platform as a whole is really the Microsoft 365 platform. This is where people spend their time in applications like Outlook and Word and Excel, the Office applications, to some extent in SharePoint, but increasingly in Teams is where people are spending all their time. And Teams is sort of a native web platform. There's the web interface, you'll have noticed, is almost identical to the desktop application, because of course the desktop application is really just an electron wrapper around the web. It's basically the same application, but some of these older applications aren't. So SharePoint is really built on top of ASP.NET, so that is web, but these Office applications, which people spend a lot of time in as well, are built using older technologies like COM and .NET. And that's given us quite a few challenges when we've wanted to extend those into other platforms like iOS and Android and mobile devices running on ARM. That's been a challenge, and so we've moved as developers from a world of doing .NET development or server-side development into more web development technologies. And that's really been the change that we've as developers, particularly SharePoint developers, have had to sort of face over the last 10 years, is moving away from building server-side code and building things client-side. We've been through a few iterations in order to get there. And then underlying everything, of course, is the intelligent cloud. It's a nice marketing term, but that really is all that information inside Microsoft 365 exposed through the Microsoft Graph, which is this REST API. And that's really how we can get at all that information and build really sophisticated business applications. And I think we're only really scratching the surface at the moment of what we can do with this, so we can build really interesting applications using all of these tools like Teams and SharePoint and Office applications that will use the power of the Microsoft Graph to get at all that information that we've got around about our business and how people are talking to each other and what documents we have in the system. And that's all itself built on top of Microsoft Identity as well. So there are some APIs to talk to the Microsoft Graph, but we do need to address the security issues as well. So there are various techniques to do that. We'll come back to it. So depending on your development background, you might be, in the old days, we used to have the sort of the front end developers. They'd spend all their time in JavaScript and they'd use libraries like jQuery, and they'd spend a lot of their time fixing problems with Internet Explorer or other browsers so that everything could work in a consistent way, and that was their role. And if you come from that background, you're probably quite comfortable with some of these newer development tools. But if you've come from the sort of the .NET background, where you've been using Visual Studio, you might dislike JavaScript. I've often found if you go to in a conference setting, you'll say, who likes JavaScript? Not so many hands will go up. Who hates JavaScript? A lot of hands will go up because it's been associated with those sort of fixes and quick hacks to solve problems in web pages. Well, there are ways of doing JavaScript development now using things like TypeScript, for example, which is a superscript of JavaScript, which is very widely used in the industry. It's a Microsoft product, but widely used. Visual Studio Code, also widely used in web development. React.js is a great JavaScript library, which I recommend looking at if you haven't already done so. It's a bit of a mind shift to get your head around it if you've not used it before. But all these tools together are kind of bringing us the sort of the simplicity of that sort of front-end development, JavaScript type, quickly write something in a very simple language, actually quite a sophisticated language, but when you get down to it. But also get some of the sort of enterprise style development techniques that we use in languages like C# with classical languages, by which I mean languages that use classes, and sort of bring the benefits of both of those together. And this is the sort of the new development landscape that web developers are using, and we're developing for applications like SharePoint. It used to feel as though we were a little bit behind the curve, and now we're very much able to use the latest tools and any tools, and we'll see how we can do that. Now, I had to put one last. I've got a space here for which of these construction kits do we use for the low-code, no-code solutions? Well, sorry, I had to do it, but that's the problem with the low-code approach. The no-code approach is you've got these sort of pre-built things that you don't get quite so much control over, so that doesn't always get you to the point where you need to be to solve very specific business problems. So if you can, of course, do it this way, because you can save a lot of time, but otherwise you probably want to look at some custom development. Then these are the tools that we're using nowadays, this modern development tool chain. And in the Microsoft world, well, with whether we're building for documents, which is things like Word and Excel, if we're building on top of conversations, which is where we're thinking particularly around Teams, or whether we're talking about pages and web pages, then that's really the SharePoint's job to deliver that. So these are the Office clients. They're all, you can think about it in terms of being a canvas. That's a useful way of thinking about this, that the Office application is a canvas where we can surface our own content, our own custom solutions. And the same with Teams, the Teams tabs, or even within the conversations, the Teams chat, we can surface things in SharePoint. Obviously, that's the whole purpose of it, is to surface content. But we've got this very consistent model, really, which is a manifest file of some type. It's usually a JSON file, but not always. So in the case of Office add-ins, we use an XML format for the manifest file, but it's the same idea. And then this JSON file points to something hosted, so a website or something static. So this could be running anywhere. It could be running in Azure, for example, or it could be running in some other cloud service, or on a machine that we have somewhere that has an internet connection. And the technology could be anything. It could be something as simple as a static website. You can now do static websites in Azure. There's a great solution for that just was announced at Build. Or it might be using Node.js for serving content from, say, an Azure web application. Or it may well be using ASP.NET, possibly ASP.NET MVC. Or it could be Ruby on Rails, if you wanted. It doesn't really matter what the technology is, as long as it's serving some content that will then be then rendered inside our application, whatever it is. So this same model we can use again and again, these manifests. And so once you get your head around, all we're really doing is surfacing content, and it might not even be content. That might be a bot, so it might be sending a request to a web endpoint, which says, that sends the response back. Hello, Bill, or whatever. If it's a bot type of interaction, a chat type of interaction, it's the same idea. It's just pointing to some endpoint on the web that we can use. So one of the issues is, where do you serve this from? So if you wanted, for example, to serve it from Azure, well, that's very easy to create a service. There's about 10 different ways of doing it in Azure, create a web app in Azure, or if you're really sophisticated, you might set up Kubernetes and a set of containers running in Azure. However you do it isn't really that important, but in a business context, it's sometimes an issue. You can't just say I want an Azure site setting up because somebody says, okay, who's going to pay for it? Has it been approved? and it's not quite so simple. So often what you really want is some way you can host stuff and do it very easily using whatever you've already got. So we come to the SharePoint framework because SharePoint can host stuff. And so we have in SharePoint development, if you've been doing SharePoint development, you'll be well aware of the SharePoint framework, which is a modern client-side development technology that's been built on top of this open source tool chain using tools that we've been talking about, like Node.js and Yeoman generators and TypeScript compilers. Using all these technologies that are very commonplace now in web development, not so much using Visual Studio, curiously enough, but using this modern tool chain, all from the command line. Remember the mug with a C colon prompt on, doing a lot of this work from the command line. It's all backwards compatible with older technologies as well, so that's worked particularly well. And again, it's any web framework or any technology really that you want to use. It's not fairly agnostic about what we use. So you can use native JavaScript, but you might decide to use a framework like React.js or even Angular or Vue. Depending on what technology you're familiar with, I would recommend this one because that's what Microsoft are using, but there's no reason you couldn't use these if that's your preference or what you're familiar with. You can use these other technologies, and so we can use that to build these solutions on top of framework. We get the user experience part of it. One of the key things is when you're building these extensions to Microsoft 365 is you try and make them look a little bit like the application that they're running inside. So there are various libraries to help you do that. And then there's the packaging and deployment stage, which we'll talk about tenant scope deployment. I'll try and remember to mention that. But this is a mechanism for deploying these solutions into SharePoint, and it does things like it takes care of hosting content. So we're using the capabilities of SharePoint to do that. And it also has this rather nice API called MS Graph Client, which gives us access to the Microsoft Graph and takes care of all of the all the authorization issues around that. So sure, you can do that yourself. You can host yourself. You can figure out how to get an access token to the Microsoft Graph yourself using libraries, but it's not easy, and that's a solved problem inside SharePoint, because SharePoint you've already authenticated against. That gives you access to all of that. So two big problems solved inside the SharePoint framework that would be quite tedious and complicated to get working correctly if you had to do that yourself. And then, as we mentioned, we've got this really modern tool chain. So you're using fairly up-to-date development techniques, fully up-to-date development techniques, rather than, as we used to feel a little bit like in the past, that we're a little bit behind the curve in terms of SharePoint development. So I've got a demo here. I've actually recorded this because there's a few time-consuming steps which I didn't want to wait for. And so we're at the command line. I'm actually using a PowerShell window to do this. And hey, it's all, we're back to ASCII art. It's like being back to the 1970s. And this is a tool called a Yeoman generator, which is the equivalent of, if you work in Visual Studio, and just notice that at that point there, it's one of the answers that was, do you want to allow the tenant admin choice to deploy the solution to all sites? And I've selected yes to that question. I'll come back to that later because that's important. A yeoman generator is really like File New Project in Visual Studio. It's just another tool to do that. And then once it's done that, that only takes a few seconds to build a set of files out for a project, and then it has to do this this sort of dependency resolution, which is a little bit like what NuGet does, and it that actually takes quite a few minutes, and I speeded that up for the purposes of time in the demo. And then I'm starting Visual Studio Code itself, a fully web-based application. This is all HTML and CSS, that this user interface that you're looking at here. Same is true of the Teams client, and it's created a file. I actually chose the React template for this. So, if you're not familiar with React, you might notice that you see it returns some div elements there, which didn't have any quotes around. There's actually a step that goes through. Clearly, that wouldn't compile or wouldn't run as JavaScript. There's a step where it comes and resolves that into these React components. So that just does take a little bit of getting used to if you're not familiar with React. And then I do gulp serve, and then there's some tooling that launches this fake SharePoint site where you can test the web part locally. Nothing requiring an actual SharePoint installation here. This is just all running locally, and you can see the web part renders. And one of the nice things about this development approach is that while that gulp serve process is running, that's actually Node.js acting. We've used Node.js as a sort of a build tool here at various steps, but now we're using Node.js a bit like we'd use IIS Express if we were using Visual Studio. It's running that test page that we were looking at. Now I can go into my source files here in Visual Studio Code and start making a few changes, fetching things. In this case, I'm actually, you see that URL is blob.core.windows.net is actually an Azure storage account that is pulling some data from, but it could also be from the Microsoft Graph. It would be just as easy to do. And we can make a few edits here, and let's say we've pulled some data back and we want to render that in the table. So these elements here that we're writing aren't actually, it's not really HTML. These are components that the React compiler is going to pick up and then convert into actually proper JavaScript that's going to execute, which is why you have this strange syntax where we've got what looks like HTML floating as an object in JavaScript, which, as I say, wouldn't compile. But there is a separate compilation step that it takes. And so one of the nice things is you get to write what looks like HTML, and it just all renders in it, and it just works. And we can escape into writing some JavaScript inside here. Now, some people don't like that because they think, well, isn't the whole point that you want to separate the script from the markup? So it's a different way of doing things. Not everybody likes it. It took me a little while to sort of come around to it, but I think if you persevere with it, I think you'll find that it kind of grows on you, and you sort of get the idea of how to do things the React way. So it's very simple code. Kind of JavaScript is then just taking all these items and then mapping them to an anonymous function that returns the elements. Now, when I save that file, it triggers the recompilation of it, and in fact it'll refresh in the browser. So it's a very nice development sort of developer flow. In fact, I'm going to make another change here, which is I'm going to take that whole function and replace it with another render that's a little bit more sophisticated, and it's still only tens of lines of code to output something. I'll just make a few changes, and then we'll save that in a second. So it's pulling in some more information. It's using an adaptive or a component from Office UI Fabric, which is a a set of React components that are designed to make it really easy to build a solution that looks like it belongs as part of one of these Office applications, Office 365 or Microsoft 365 applications. So we've done that. I think, do we need to chivvy this along a little bit in the interests of time? I think we will. Just do a quick fast forward a little bit. So we've saved the file and it does a rebuild of it. Again, as I say, it does this automatically because it's watching the file system for changes. And now we've got a rather more sophisticated rendering of that list that we pulled out of Azure. And if we click on one of those items, it will render a picture of the building for this sort of building management solution that we've created in this web part. So that's great. That's a web part. What relevance is that to Teams? Well, Teams, as in one or two of the earlier sessions in the conference, has many extension points. So there's the tabs, there's also bots, messaging extensions, connectors, a number of extension points. And what we commonly do is, and the example here is Trello, is if you wanted to build a Trello Teams application, you'd probably use several of these in combination. So you'd probably have a connector and a bot and a tab, so the tab would give you that sort of the Kanban view. The bot would be something where you could ask questions, and the connector would allow you to sort of use it to push things into there or connect it to some other system. So this is quite a common pattern. Is it's not just a tab or a bot. It might be a tab and a bot and a connector and a messaging extension. So one way of setting these up is we can go into Teams, and I love that when you have a tool for building things where it is the thing that you're building. So this is a Teams app called App Studio, which has that chat panel where you can ask it questions and it'll help you, or you can go to this manifest editor and you can create one of these manifest files. So I've created a new one here, and it just takes you through the steps, the things you need to add. So I need to give it a name, I need to give it a description and a longer description. As you can see, I'm not being very imaginative in the choice of wording for these descriptions. And there's a few things down here. You need to give it the developer name, and it wants a website, and these things, they have to be correct website syntax or web address syntax. Don't worry about that partner ID at the moment, but we do need a privacy statement in the terms of use. Doesn't have to be anything at the end of these. I'm just going to put some values in. Now, if I wanted to submit this to the Microsoft Store, then they would check these, and so you would have to have an actual privacy statement and a terms of use behind those sites. Or I've just provided some arbitrary strings, but just some arbitrary but valid URLs. So once you've set up those app details, you can then go ahead and start creating some tabs and bots and things. So remember, at this stage, all we're doing is editing a manifest file. We're not building anything. So, for example, the team tab, we can create a team tab. I still have to build something at the whatever URL I put in here. I need to build an application behind that. I mean, that's obviously where all the work is. And the same thing when if I go to a personal tab. But the nice thing is it helps you by saying, these are the things that you need to input, which is a little bit easier than editing a manifest file directly. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but that ID does need to be unique, though. And then again, we can provide, in the case of a personal tab, there's a content URL, which is the content that's going to be actually rendered in the tab. And then there's the website URL is, one of the things you get in a tab is an alternate link to a website if you want to view that in a web page rather than inside Teams. And the same thing with bots. We can go on to set up a bot, but again, you need an endpoint that you've created, perhaps using Microsoft's bot framework or perhaps using some other technology. As long as it can respond to requests, then we put something. But typically we'll use the bot framework for that. We can also use that for connectors and messaging extensions. And then what I can do is download this manifest that I've created. I get a zip file, and if we crack open that zip file and see what's inside it, so this is our Teams manifest. Contains a couple of images, which is what it presents to the user when you're picking one of these, and then this is the manifest file, which is JSON, and that's going to give us the correctly formatted version of all that information that we input into it. So there's this manifest file. So that's one way of creating one of these manifest files. So typically what we'd do is we'd start probably with a tab. It's probably the easiest thing we can create in Teams is a tab, because all it really is an external website rendered inside a Teams tab. And we get some context from there as well. We can also, one of the places we could get the Teams tab content from is SharePoint. So as I say, that gets us around the problem of where do I host stuff. I could just have something in SharePoint and then render that inside the Teams page. But what we can also do is we can use the SharePoint framework. And so if I go back to this solution that we created, which I call Facilitate, and we go into Visual Studio Code, and now instead of looking at that TSX file, which is the React TypeScript file, which has the code that was rendered, I can go to this manifest file. There's actually an option here called supported hosts, and if you can add either a Teams personal tab or a Teams tab to that, as well as a couple of other options. And what that does is it says that I want this web part that I've created using the SharePoint framework to be rendered either as a SharePoint web part or as a Teams tab. So I've added a Teams tab. Now, it might well be that you design something that's specifically for Teams, and you don't want it to render it in SharePoint, so you could just say just a Teams tab. So you might be building web parts that are just for Teams and web parts that are just for SharePoint, and you might be building web parts that are for both. And then I go off and I do a gulp bundle ship and a gulp gulp bundle ship, which is really run Webpack, which is a tool for packaging all these different components together. And then package solution, again, minus ship is so gulp is really just the task runner inside this sort of tool chain. So a bit like MS Build. And then once I've done that, that's generated the output files, which includes, amongst other things, this SP package file. So if I use the Explorer to find that file, it's the same file now, which is Facilitate SP package. That file is actually a zip file in the same format as a SharePoint solution that we'd deploy if we're building using some other technology. So that SP package file, I can find my way to the solution gallery and to the app catalog. And then I can go to apps for SharePoint. And now I'm going to add that SP package file that is generated. And at this point, you'll see when it gives me the approval dialog, the consent dialog comes up, and it will say, when it eventually comes up, there's an option here, make this solution available to all sites in the organization. That appears, I've checked that appears because when I originally created that solution, I said I wanted to be tenant-wide deployment. And because we added that extra option for Teams tab, this Sync to Teams button lights up in the app catalog, and I can click on that, and that will then take care of everything. And that solution package contains, amongst other things, the Teams manifest file. And so that will appear in this. I have to refresh this page because it's a web view into Teams. But once I've deployed that, the Teams manifest will also be deployed, and then I can go down and search down here to add a tab, and I should see Facilitate somewhere. There it is, and I can deploy that and say add it to this team. And now when it eventually starts up, save that. And now the application that we built as a SharePoint web part now appears as a Teams tab, along with all that sort of capability and sort of the sort of look and feel and all that behavior has come across again. But I know it's all hosted in SharePoint, so it's really solved two problems by doing this. I've solved my hosting problem. I don't have to go, I've got a SharePoint site. So if I'm in Teams, I must have a SharePoint site. So I can use that to host it. And I can also take care of accessing the Microsoft graph with it, because it's running inside the context of a SharePoint page. And so all of that authorization is a solved problem for me. So that makes a lot of things a lot easier. So a great way of building, not the only way, but a very good way of building a Teams application. A few tips and tricks are, a good idea is, it might be that you can build something that you can use both in a SharePoint page and in the Teams context as well. That might make sense, but it might not. And so you don't be afraid to design something just specifically for Teams, and don't overcomplicate it. So it's generally a bad idea to try and do everything in one application. So it's focus on a task. And this applies across the board to all of these Microsoft 365 extensions. Is just keep focused on what you're trying to do, what business benefit or you're trying to give a user, rather than try and think about how clever you can be putting everything into one solution. Content over Chrome, and so not too much in terms of the decorative stuff. Keep it. The users are interested in content, so that's what we want to give them, and not too much Chrome or branding. Give them control. Consider all the input messages, methods that they might want to use, and there's a good technique is to give them some sort of first run experience that sort of helps them to use the application when it deploys it. So there's a useful link here to some resources to help with the design. So it's yet another fantastic way to extend business productivity by building solutions of various levels of sophistication. We've got the whole of the Microsoft 365 platform and all of the things behind that to work with. Now, there may well be no code solutions that we can use as well, but a lot of times that isn't quite enough. We need, or it becomes so complicated to try and come up with a node code solution that it's sometimes easier to build something if you've got the skills, or the people in house have those skills to build things for these more more business specific use cases. But these might be new skills for you. If you didn't like JavaScript, look again. TypeScript will make things easier. It's a superset of JavaScript that's much easier to use and much more like C#, if that's, or Java for that matter, if you're used to using these classical languages. But these open source development tools are great. That's changing rapidly. That's the only thing, is you've got to keep up to date with all these different possibilities. So thank you very much. I hope that was useful. We've got about 5 minutes left. Do go to dev.office.com and sign up for that if you haven't already done so. That's an old link, but it still works. It'll take you there. There's some sample code, and there's that link will take you to some videos which can introduce the topic for you. And then, yeah, do have a think about some business challenges that you can come up with solutions using these kinds of techniques. So I hope, as I say, it was useful, and I think we've probably got a few minutes, Lee, for questions if anybody has any.
Yep, thanks for that, Bill. That was a good session. We've got a question which is, can I build an SPFX package and host it in the public Microsoft Store for Teams to reach a larger range of organizations, or do I have to deploy it per SharePoint App Store on each tenant?
Yeah, no, you can. So there is a route to publish, and if I could, I'll probably find it. So if you go to, just get rid of my annotations. Let's see if I can very quickly find the. So it's kind of interesting that if you go to the, I think they keep moving this around, but it's now the Partner Center, I think it is, that you go to. You can go to the Partner Center and then down here somewhere, Office Store overview. Yes, so if you want to create a new application, so Teams is one of the options. So you can create deploy that as a Teams app, and that is an option. But you will have to, if it's backed by SharePoint, you'll need the SharePoint component as well.
Okay, great. And I think the only other was more a comment, really, just saying it was a great and clear talk.
Thank you.
And they enjoyed it.
Great, thanks very much.
So unless we get any more questions through, I think that's going to be the session. If you want to speak with Bill following this session, then I'm going to quickly post a link into the channel where we have a breakout session, and we can discuss after this session ends. So I'll post that in now, and we'll see you all on the other side.
Great. I shall follow you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.